With solar energy becoming more affordable and efficient, a host of developing countries are using the technology for electricity. Hello, I'm Nathan King in for Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. For the first time, developing countries installed more renewable energy than developed countries in 2015. Countries such as India, Brazil, Chile and Mexico are producing clean, sustainable energy with solar power. China is the world's largest investor in renewable energy and is a leader in the world of solar expansion. And in the United States, analysts are forecasting the solar market could soar to nearly 120% this year. We begin with this report from CCTV's Jessica Stone, who spoke with industry experts at the recent solar summit in Scottsdale, Arizona.
Just last week, the U.S. marked its 1 millionth solar panel installation. It took 40 years. Analysts say it'll only take 2 years to install another 1 million.
By 2020, we are going to be generating enough electricity to power 20 million homes here in the United States. So we are really at that inflection where solar starts to take off.
One reason solar is soaring, it's less expensive and more efficient than ever. Installing these panels in the U.S. cost 70% less than it did in 2009. Industry analysts at the Solar Summit say government incentives also play a major role.
We see the importance of government incentives in Europe, where the feed-in tariffs across the board for many countries were pulled back in the last 3 to 4 years, and that really sort of destroyed the market there to some extent.
This solar summit comes just a few weeks after more than 150 countries from around the world signed on to the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement. Industry analysts say that sends a powerful signal that developing countries will be relying on solar to meet their targets for years to come.
COP21 definitely comes in and says, well, if you do take the risk to go into these countries, we're giving you the confidence that there will be a framework in place, there will be a global commitment in place to support you with regulations that will help you become more competitive and have sort of de-risk you a little bit. And most importantly, that we will have financing available for you.
China is leading the world in solar expansion. It plans to triple solar energy production in the next 4 years, adding as much as 20 gigawatts every year. India is a distant number 2, but it's making solar power the cornerstone of meeting its Paris climate commitments. India also has the advantage of receiving 300 days of sunshine each year.
The Prime Minister enhanced the target from 20,000 megawatt to 100,000 megawatt, a 5-fold change in India's target.
Analysts say countries like Chile, Mexico, Thailand, and the Philippines also have higher quality sunshine than northern European nations do, which means one solar panel can produce more electricity.
Essentially, for one panel that you put in Germany, you'd get far less energy out than one panel that you would put in Chile.
But storing the power of the sun, once harnessed, still remains a challenge, one the industry is still working to figure out. Jessica Stone, CCTV, Scottsdale, Arizona.
Joining us now from Beijing is Wang Tao. He's the Assistant Director of the China Business New Research Institute. And here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio is Robert Aiello. He is an Energy Principal Specialist with the Inter-American Development Bank. And from New Delhi, we are joined by Renewables Ghosh. He is the CEO and Council of Energy and Environment and Water in India. And also with us is Alex Pereira. He is the Global Director of the Electricity Initiative at World Resources Institute. Thanks so much, all 4 of you, to joining us. Tao, I want to start with you in Beijing. 2015 saw China become the largest solar market, surpassing Germany. Why is China investing so much in solar energy, and why is it such a good fit for China?
Yeah, thank you, Nathan. The thing is that China invests so much in the solar energies First one is China's promise to the climate change and also to its own response in tackling the air pollutions. As we already think that China promised to reach the carbon peak by 2030 or as soon as possible, and also to have 20% of the non-fossil fuel energy by 2030. That is a promise China made last year in the Paris Agreement. And in order to achieving that, the renewable energy, especially like the wind power and the solar PV, is going to play a very big role. So this is the first layer of the motivation that China wants to feel the international responsibilities. The second one is China also views these two industries, or renewable energy in general, the strategic importantly in industries for its future economic development. It hopes that by promoting these industries, it will be able to give Chinese economy the advantage in the future a carbon constrained and low carbon economy. So China will be able to benefit from the development of these industries from these years. On the third aspect, I think China also has a little bit of the selfish consideration, because we all knew that China has the world's largest capacity of the solar PV manufacturing. China produced almost 70% or 60 to 70% of the total solar PV panels in the world. And for China itself, it's also beneficial to have the capacity to absorb this capacity of the productions, and also helps the local economies to flourish.
Yeah, build it and they will come. There's a similar target in India, isn't there, Arunabha? Really quite ambitious targets. 40% of electricity from renewables by 2030. And considering India is going to be probably the most populous country in the world by then, with over 1.4 billion people, is that achievable?
Oh, most surely we can achieve it. But let me just correct that, Nathan. The target for 2030 is 40% of electricity generation capacity from non-fossil sources. That includes renewables as well as nuclear.
And hydro as well,
but
I suppose.
Even within renewables, we've got a massive target, as well as hydro, that's right. So we have a massive target of 175 gigawatts, or 175,000 megawatts of solar, wind, and biomass by 2022. And that basically implies that what we're trying to do in the renewable energy sector in 7 years is what took Germany about 21 years to achieve. So it's a massive target being driven by an economy at a much lower level of development. So it is really a leapfrogging to a different energy system.
Roberto, I want you to pick up on that, because 2015, the first year that developing countries are investing more into renewables like solar than the developed countries. Why is this? How has that happened?
Thanks, Nathan. Look, renewable energy development keeps largely shaped by government policy and government action. And you can see that there has been a decrease in the support policies in some countries in the developed world lately. For instance, in Europe, there's a new imposition for taxes on renewable energy generation. And there's also the expiration of the federal production tax credit in the US. On the other hand, you can see that in the developing world, there's more and more countries are adding targets and specific actions towards renewable energy development. So these two actions coupled together result in that figure that you're mentioning. But of course, this is probably biased by the inclusion of China. If you remove China out of the equation, probably this not goes in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, China does account for something like 67% of the new capacity. Alex, we're seeing a lot of solar panels here in the United States go up, even here in Washington, D.C. And of course, the price coming down has really helped, hasn't it? How's that happened? And of course, that helps developing countries?
Well, yeah, this is an incredible phenomenon. The cost of renewables has dropped very quickly. And consumers are taking notice. So not just the individual household consumers who are putting panels on their roofs, but the large, fast-growing sectors like IT, Facebook and Google, even manufacturers, GM, Volvo, and others are coming together to say, you know what, we demand renewable energy. We've got global targets. We want to find ways to access this more affordably. And there was a recent launch WRI was part of with a coalition of companies and NGOs called the Renewable Energy Buyers Alliance, which is basically the companies coming to the market saying, we want renewables, we're willing to work with our electric utilities to develop new, more innovative business models to get this.
Yeah, and India's going to host a Renewables Alliance, a Solar Alliance as well, very much targeting that. Hal, I want to just bring you in again, because it's all very well to say China is going to triple its solar capacity by 2020, but at the same time, China is still the largest emitter of coal. Is this a race between the sun and the earth in terms of who wins out in terms of energy? Can renewable energy actually get to a place where it can make a significant difference in China when it comes to air quality?
That's a great question, Nathan. I think we all recognize that in China and in the foreseeable future, coal is still will be the dominant player of the energy mix, because at the end of the day, even today, coal still accounts for about over 60% of China's total energy demand. And there is already a huge targets being set by Chinese government, and the ambition for renewables such as solar PV and wind are dramatic. I think, as you just mentioned, solar PV capacity is going to triple in a few years' time, and also China is going to double its already were the #1 wind capacity, wind power capacity by 2020. So this is a huge improvement and increase of the scales in the renewable energy. But if you will think about what is the scale of the electricity generated from, for example, coal and hydro and other sources, they are not so big. Today, China generates about over 70% of the electricity from the coal. So that is the major source of the air pollution in China, the consumption of coal and also the coal. But the other 20% is coming from hydro, which is so far the largest source of the non-fossil fuel. But that has been built for many decades, limited by the capacity. There is limited room for China to increase that. And despite all this increase, recently very dramatic increase in China in the wind and solar PV, wind only accounts for about 3%, and solar is only 0.5%. So they are going to grow much quicker and also have a bigger role to play. But I think it also takes time for them to play a very big role in China's electricity demand.
Let's go to New Delhi. Arun Nabha, what challenges, of course, does India face? China seems very, very optimistic about meeting its targets on time, if not earlier. There's always a hint in there. Is India going to be on the same level?
Yeah, I think so, because I think the drive towards a cleaner energy future has been driven by a number of different factors. Number one is policy. Even within the fossil fuel side, we now have a provision that from 2017, every new coal power plant is going to be what is called ultra supercritical or more advanced. Means the efficiency level of the next coal power plant that comes on is going to be at least 30 to 40% cleaner than anything else that exists so far. The second thing is that we see a much larger rollout of renewables happening in India much sooner than it occurred in China. So China built out about 1,000 gigawatts of coal before the renewables revolution began there. In India, the renewables revolution is happening when the entire electricity capacity is just about 280 gigawatts. Against that, we are trying to build out 175 gigawatts of solar and wind and biomass. So the rollout of renewables is happening at a much earlier stage. And the third big factor is, I think, the way the businesses are evolving. We've got a very clear mechanism of what is called reverse auctioning, which and every tender that is put out, there is a lowering of the prices. So this is not extra government money going in. It's actually the businesses coming and competing with each other to drive the prices lower. So I think these facts make sure that we do achieve the targets we're setting.
That's an interesting point. Roberto, Latin America has long been a sort of fossil fuel paradise, if you like, in terms of both what it has on the ground and what it's used. What's bringing about the change in Latin America?
Well, Nathan, yeah, that's true, but there's also a very high interest in renewables. Latin America is meeting about 60% of its electricity demand on average from renewables. That includes hydropower, of course. If you remove non-nuclear includes hydropower, but if you remove hydro, then we also expect that there's going to be an increase, as we are seeing in recent years, in other non-conventional renewable sources. And this is mainly driven by high electricity prices across most countries in the region, growing demand, and there is a rising awareness within government agencies that there is a need for diversifying energy supply, meaning energy security. Latin America, exactly.
Alex, before we go to Ray, I want a big question from you. Okay, we saw from NASA and other agencies that 2015 was the hottest year on record. Can solar and other renewables make the switch quickly enough so that we meet the targets that were set at the Paris Climate Conference, or do you think we're still lagging behind all the efforts that we've just been talking about?
Well, look, we're very good at under-predicting the potential for renewables. IEA comes out with their statements of projections for renewables, and every year they're wrong. They under-predict. So I think that there are some real convergences between the business case of renewables and the awareness that there's some side effects of the fossil fuel. We talked about pollution, we talked about water impacts, energy security issues. And so as countries look to develop, they're increasingly looking to renewables, not because they're members of the Sierra Club, but because they see this to be the economic development path that's best for their people.
Sierra Club, of course, a big environmental group here in the United States, and a healthy dose of American optimism to take us to the break. We do need to take a break. More of our conversation about solar energy after this. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. The experimental plane Solar Impulse 2 is now in Tulsa, Oklahoma, after completing an 18-hour, 970-mile flight from Phoenix, Arizona. Pilot Bertram Picard is circling the globe using only the power of the sun. Picard and his team set off from Abu Dhabi in March of 2015, traveling to Myanmar, China, Japan, Hawaii, and California. The plane has the wingspan as big as a jumbo jet, but weighs just as much as a family sports utility vehicle.
Solar Impulse has no fuel, it flies only with the sun. But it's the beginning of something experimental, it's a door slightly open to the future, pushing the technologies to the extreme ultimate application.
The plane flies at less than 90 kilometers per hour, a fraction of the speed of a hot air balloon. The crew will next head east across the US to New York before crossing the Atlantic Ocean. You know, inventions like this are changing the conversation about solar and what it's able to power. Let's get back to our panel. First of all, I want to go back to Wangtao in Beijing. Quite an incredible plane there. But China's thinking about building entire cities, in fact, is doing so. In Tianjin, is this a good model, considering there are 100 million people moving from the countryside into cities? You have to build this renewables from the ground up?
Yes, exactly. I think the urbanization is actually one of the most important drivers for China's economic growth, and also the movements that we have to address to accommodate and also people's needs. Every year, China has more than 13 million people moving from the rural areas to the urban areas to make a living. So this urbanization process will take decades until China probably will reach to the developed countries level. So how to accommodate those people in the cities, in the old cities and new built cities is a question. And China indeed actually initiated a large round of the low carbon and the so-called eco-city in China for the last few years. And one of the most prominent one is this one you just mentioned, the Tianjin Eco-City in collaboration with the Singaporean government. But I think there is also a risk or maybe a consideration that we need to take into account when we're talking about eco-city. Then Chinese city planners or local government always are fond of creating cities for themselves, for people. So they think that if they create, they clear out land and build the cities, build the buildings and plan out the road, there will be people moving into. So they are thinking about city for the people. But indeed, actually, cities should serve for people's needs. You need to actually build cities around people's activities. It's not always the situation that when you build the cities and people just naturally move in, because people do not work there, they do not live there, and they found it's inconvenient. In some cases in China, they actually did manage to make people moving into the cities. Sometimes by the signals of the price of the housing, or sometimes by the government command. But people also find they cannot work there, they cannot find enough jobs there. Just as the case in Tianjin, I think it's too early to say whether this is going to be a very successful model or not.
Arun Ghosh in New Delhi, I saw you nodding heavily at that. You know, India also a rapidly urbanizing population. And, you know, if you look at the 19th century model in Europe, for example, urbanization meant more of pollution and energy. How do we square the circle on this one? What's India's plan?
I think there are two plans there. One is a massive smart cities mission that the government has launched, which is to kind of upgrade existing cities as well as build new cities that integrate technology, new forms of building design, new forms of transportation design, and as Wang Tao was also saying, making sure that they become commercial hubs. But specifically on renewables, if you look at India's solar target of 100 gigawatts, 40 gigawatts of that, so 40% of that is meant to come from rooftop solar, which is basically your house,
right. Back into the
my
grid.
school, the shopping mall, the hospital. They then become the kind of the sources of energy as well as the consumers of energy. So our solar targets are not so much as top-down, but bottom-up, converting the consumer into the producer and seller of electricity gives them a business interest and a stake in this new kind of energy system. But even in rural areas, we have another massive plan of converting irrigation pump sets, of which we have 30 million, several million of those into solar-based irrigation. And that itself can get us about 20 gigawatts of solar power. So there are multiple pathways, both in rural areas as well as in urban areas, for a renewables rollout in India.
Just fascinating, all this innovation going on, isn't it, Roberto? But usually, heavy extraction industries in energy like coal create the most jobs. But there are reports out there, for example, Brazil could create 4 million jobs by adopting renewable energy. Is this right? Because I always thought that renewable energies didn't create jobs. Look at wind farms here and stuff like that.
Thanks, Nathan. That's a great question. I think there's a number of policies that can be developed and can put in place to create jobs. When it comes, you mentioned Brazil. It's an interesting case because they have this local content requirement to have access to preferential financial funding for developers of renewable energy. And this can come in different forms through percentage of investments, through local hiring, or through local inputs or materials, raw materials. And so if you want as a developer to access those preferential terms in Brazil through the National Development Bank, you have to include the local content requirements. And these sort of policies aim normally to create local jobs and create a local value supply chain.
It's interesting, isn't it, that so many parts of the world are leaping ahead with this. But Alex, we're also seeing one area, Europe, actually start lagging behind, even though they were pioneers of renewables back in the 1980s. Why is that?
Well, yeah, there's probably a couple reasons. I mean, right now, Europe is in an economic recession, so that's putting pressure on budgets.
But, I mean, the world slowed down, China's slowing down, I mean...
Yeah, not as fast.
right.
But the other thing is demand growth isn't growing, right, for electricity. So in environments like China, India, where demand is growing fast for electricity, there's a lot of willingness to bring on new investment, new technologies to meet that growing demand, come up with innovative business models. In countries like Europe, where demand is flat, it becomes a little trickier because, you know, if you add renewables, and you get a stranded asset issue, and then there's more opposition to some of these plants. So, you know, there are a couple factors that sort of explain the slower investment.
So a cautionary tale for developing countries as they become more developed as well. Tao, I want to focus on the technology because everyone thinks of solar power as the big panels on your roof. But something we discovered at the Arizona Summit and elsewhere is this technology is just becoming so incredible. In fact, Chinese companies are going to light up the Rio Olympic Games as they open. But we're going to see solar power potential on our smartphones, so we don't have to constantly charge them an outlet. Are you seeing the technology evolve in China and elsewhere?
Yeah, I think China is actually doing a great deal of the development in the solar PV and also other renewable energies. By investing into these industries, they actually help to reduce the costs because of the massive scales that China is investing and also manufacturing. And there is also, just as mentioned, China and the countries like India is the country with the largest demand, so the market is growing very fast. That also provides opportunities for those technologies to be employed in this these countries. So I think there is a great deal of the contribution China can make.
I really have to ask this question of Arunabha. I travelled to India by rail when I was a teenager, and it completely was an amazing experience. I hear that now in India they're putting solar panels on the tops of diesel trains to help actually bring in energy. This sounds like a really Indian innovation, using what you've got. Explain it to me.
Well, I mean, I'm glad you brought up the railways, because the railways is the lifeline of India.
Absolutely.
And they, in a way, they serve as the cauldron of experimentation. So what these panels on the train carriages are doing, they can't give you traction power, but they can help you with the lighting, the air conditioning, etc., within the carriages. So that's a start. But guess what? We've got more than 8,000 railway stations in India, and so we now have a plan of putting in solar panels on the top of the platforms. Number 3, there are large numbers of railway residential colonies, and the plan is to again put solar panels there and use that to power neighboring villages. So the railways alone has a plan of putting out at least 1.5 gigawatts, so about 1,500 megawatts of solar capacity in the next few years. But what it does is it gets a lot of other people excited about it, because you're interacting with that technology on a daily basis. And that's what I'm trying to say, that in India, the rollout of renewables is not a top-down story. It is really many different sectors, consumptive and productive and infrastructural and transport, which are opening up these opportunities for the consumers to see, here's a new technology. It's not going to solve all your problems overnight of air pollution, etc., but this is really the future, and here's where the business opportunities lie. And that's why India has spearheaded this international solar alliance of 120 countries, along with France, to bring them together to offer an even bigger market, so that technologists, investors can look at this massive new market that is being created, at least generate $1 trillion of investment in solar power alone over the next 15 years.
Yeah, that's a very important step. Alex, last word, given what we've just heard from New Delhi, where do you think the new innovation is going to come from in terms of solar and renewables?
Well, yeah, there are a lot of exciting innovations, and I think, as was mentioned, the Solar Alliance, Mission Innovation, these international collaborations to bring the cost, invest in R&D are really important. I think there's a couple things. There's some new technologies that promise to bring the cost to about cut the cost by 75% over the next few years, which is really impressive. There's also innovations in the form of solar. So transparent cells that can replace glass, used in office buildings,
smartphones,
solar shingles, smartphones. So there's going to be a lot of innovation about where you can put solar and generate power. And so for cities, that's very relevant, where space is constrained. The other piece that we're finding is that with green buildings, developers are finding more demand for buildings that are green, higher occupancy rate, less turnover. That becomes a very valuable business proposition. So looking for ways to marry the business case of green buildings with the innovations and form of new solar technologies is going to be very exciting for the future.
Well, on that note, we'll end it. The future is bright for solar, it looks like. That's it for this edition of Heat. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Nathan King in Washington, D.C.